Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. In this week's box office roundup video for the weekend that ended on December 8th, 2024, a re-released 10-year-old movie from 2014 almost made it into this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office, but the premiere of one new foreign movie prevented that from happening. Still, later in the video, I will be saying a bit more about that re-released 2014 movie and several other new movies that premiered this weekend, which it outperformed. But the cumulative total earnings for this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office fell considerably to $115.6 million, which was a 56.86% decrease as compared with last weekend's adjusted cumulative total of $267.9 million. But this was still a very good weekend for movie theaters because this was the third consecutive weekend that the cumulative total was more than $100 million. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please leave a comment, please subscribe to support this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! So this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office included the following. Clinging to number 1 was Walt Disney Animation Studios' sequel entitled Moana 2. Clinging to number 2 was Universal Pictures and Mark Platt Productions' musical fantasy entitled Wicked, starring Cynthia Erivo, Ariana Grande, Jeff Goldblum, and Michelle Yeoh. Clinging to number 3 was Paramount Pictures, Scott Free Films, Lucy Fisher's, and Douglas Wick's historical drama Gladiator II, starring Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, and Pedro Pascal. Opening at number 4 was the foreign Indian Telugu movie entitled Pushpa: The Rule Part 2. And falling to number 5 was 7 Bucks Productions, Chris Morgan Productions, detective agencies Amazon MGM Studios, and MGM Pictures' very high-budgeted Christmas action comedy entitled Red One, starring Dwayne Johnson, Chris Evans, and Lucy Liu. Domestically, Moana 2 earned another $52 million during the weekend and $22.6 million during the week to bring its current domestic box office total up to $300 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $134.7 million to bring its current international box office total up to $300 million. So globally, the movie earned another $209.3 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $600 million. Domestically, Wicked earned another $34.9 million during the weekend and $22.5 million during the week to bring its current domestic box office total up to $320.5 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $38.2 million to bring its current international box office total up to $135 million. So globally, the movie earned another $95.5 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $455.6 million. Domestically, Gladiator II earned another $12.5 million during the weekend and $8.8 million during the week to bring its current domestic box office total up to $132.7 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $26.9 million to bring its current international box office total up to $235.7 million. So globally, the movie earned another $48.1 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $368.4 million. The foreign Indian Telugu movie entitled Pushpa: The Rule Part 2 opened by earning $9.3 million domestically, but has not yet earned anything internationally. Domestically, Red One earned another $7 million during the weekend and $2.9 million during the week to bring its current domestic box office total up to $85.8 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $5.6 million to bring its current international box office total up to $78.2 million. So globally, the movie earned another $15.5 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $164 million. Now, normally, I don't necessarily talk about the earnings for movies that were below the domestic top 5 unless I have been previously tracking them, or they never have been in the domestic top 5 after premiering, and they are sufficiently interesting for one or more reasons to talk about. And this weekend, there were 2 movies in particular that were below the top 5 that are rather interesting. The first one is the re-released movie from 2014, which was Interstellar, and which earned another $4.4 million to bring its current domestic box office total up to $192.4 million. And when combined with its $458 million in international earnings, means that its global gross box office earnings increased to $650.5 million. But what made this re-released 2014 movie Interstellar interesting? First, it was the 6th highest grossing movie domestically for the weekend, and had the Indian Telugu movie Pushpa: The Rule Part 2 not premiered, or had it not earned as much as the re-released Interstellar, then Interstellar would have been the 5th highest grossing movie domestically for this past weekend. But what truly makes the re-released Interstellar interesting is that its $4.4 million in domestic box office was earned by playing at only 165 movie theaters across the US, which means that on average it earned around $26,818 per theater. And that $26,818 in earnings per theater is significant because it was considerably more than each of the average earnings per theater for all of the domestic top 5 movies, including Moana 2, which averaged around $12,381 in earnings per theater at 4,200 movie theaters. So had Interstellar been able to maintain that $26,818 in average earnings per theater while playing at a lot more theaters, it would definitely have earned a lot more money domestically overall this past weekend. So much so that had it played at twice as many theaters, it might have been the 5th highest grossing movie domestically with possible earnings of $8.8 million. And had it played at 3 times as many theaters, it might have been the 3rd highest grossing movie domestically with possible earnings of $13.2 million, which would have been more than the domestic earnings of Gladiator II, but while playing at 85.6% fewer theaters than Gladiator II. But conceivably, had Interstellar been shown at 12 times as many movie theaters, then it might have earned around $53.1 million, which would have made it the #1 movie for the weekend by outperforming Moana 2, while playing at 52.9% fewer theaters. That's all very speculative, of course, but it demonstrates that just as has been occurring on multiple streaming services, older movies and shows are often being streamed a lot more than brand new content. In fact, while only playing at 165 movie theaters, Interstellar outperformed the premieres of 9 other movies this past weekend that were all being shown at a lot more than 165 movie theaters. And of those 9 movies that premiered, the movie that premiered at the most number of theaters was A24's movie Y2K, which was playing at 2,108 movie theaters and only earned around $2.1 million domestically for its opening weekend, which works out to an average of $1,003 in earnings per theater. So the 10-year-old re-released movie Interstellar earned more than twice as much overall as the brand new movie Y2K by earning 26.7 times as much as Y2K did per theater at 92.2% fewer theaters. And who was one of the biggest stars in Y2K? Why, none other than the highly controversial and toxic woke identity politics activist and actress Rachel Zegler, who will be starring in Disney's soon-to-be future 2025 flop, Snow White, in around 3 months. And if you didn't watch my previous video entitled Disney's newest Snow White trailer on YouTube heavily ratioed and rejected, which I had released on December 7th, I highly recommend it. And by the way, the movie Y2K is a flop because its production budget is reported to be $15 million, and it's currently unclear whether it will be shown in any other foreign countries outside of the US and Canada. Thus, with only one cinematic exception, Y2K once again demonstrates that Rachel Zegler is nearly always the kiss of death for any movie's box office earnings that she's in. But let's move on. And as of this weekend, the 3 highest grossing movies, both domestically and worldwide, for 2024 remained Disney Pixar's animated movie Inside Out 2, Disney and Marvel Studios' MCU movie Deadpool and Wolverine, and Illumination Entertainment's animated sequel Despicable Me 4. Domestically, all three of these movies have ended their theatrical runs, so their final domestic box office earnings remain at $653 million, $636.7 million, and $361 million, respectively, and all three remain the highest grossing movies domestically so far this year. So Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine are the only two movies so far this year that have broken $600 million domestically. Further, Deadpool and Wolverine became the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time domestically. But internationally, each of these three movies are continuing to earn additional revenue. For Inside Out 2, the movie earned another $94,000 internationally to bring its current international box office total up to $1,045.6 million. So the movie's current global gross box office total increased by the same amount to $1,698.5 million, and it remains the first and only movie so far this year to break $1.6 billion worldwide. Further, Inside Out 2 has now earned $252.9 million more than last year's highest grossing movie, Barbie, which earned $1,445.6 million. For Deadpool and Wolverine, the movie earned another $14,000 internationally, so its current international box office total remained about the same at $701.3 million. So the movie's current global gross box office total increased by the same amount to $1,338.1 million. So Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine remain the only movies so far this year to have broken $1 billion globally, while Deadpool and Wolverine remains the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time. In terms of the MCU, Deadpool and Wolverine became the franchise's sixth highest grossing movie worldwide of all time by outperforming the $1,336.5 million that was earned in 2018 by the movie Black Panther. It's also the first MCU movie since 2021's Spider-Man No Way Home to break $1 billion at the global box office. For Despicable Me 4, the movie's reported international box office earnings from last week appear to have been adjusted downward slightly from $1 million to $886,000 to readjust its current international box office total down slightly to $608.1 million. So the movie's current global gross box office total was also adjusted downward slightly by the same amount to $969.1 million. And it remains only the third movie so far this year to have broken $900 million globally. The reported production budgets for Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Despicable Me 4 are $200 million, $250 million, and $100 million respectively. And to estimate what their break-even point ranges might be, I'll multiply each movie's production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. And when I do that, we get the following estimated break-even point ranges. For Inside Out 2, we get an estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million. For Deadpool and Wolverine, we get an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. And for Despicable Me 4, we get an estimated break-even point range of $250 million to $300 million. Thus, all three of these movies have made bank. I'm also tracking several other movies that are no longer in or never were in the top 5, which includes the following. Falling to number 14 was Columbia Pictures, Marvel Entertainment's, and several other companies' Marvel threequel entitled Venom: The Last Dance. And falling to number 25 was Universal Pictures and DreamWorks Animation's movie entitled The Wild Robot. Domestically, Venom: The Last Dance earned another $675,000 to bring its current domestic box office total up to $139.1 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $3.4 million to bring its current international box office total up to $333.7 million. So globally, the movie earned another $4.6 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $472.8 million. Domestically, The Wild Robot earned another $117,000 to bring its current domestic box office total up to $142.8 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $115,000 to bring its current international box office total up to $179.2 million. So globally, the movie earned another $386,000 to bring its current global gross box office total up to $322 million. Now, to know whether these movies are going to break even or not, as well as how much money they might be losing, we need to estimate their break-even points. When a movie's marketing budget is known, we can add it to the movie's production budget and then multiply the sum by 2. Otherwise, we can multiply the production budget by 2.5 for a single mid-range estimated break-even point, or by both 2.5 and 3.0 for a broader estimated break-even point range. Both methods account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves. For Moana 2, with its reported production budget of around $150 million, as reported by Screen Rant, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $375 million to $450 million. For Wicked, with its reported production budget of around $150 million, as reported by Screen Rant, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $375 million to $450 million. For Gladiator II, with its reported very high production budget of $250 million, as reported by Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. For Red One, with its reported very high production budget of $250 million, as reported by Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. For Venom: The Last Dance, with its production budget of $120 million, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $300 million to $360 million. For The Wild Robot, with its production budget of $78 million, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $195 million to $234 million. So in this video, I am no longer projecting or never have projected what the final domestic or global gross box office earnings might be for the movies Venom: The Last Dance or The Wild Robot, because their expected future earnings are either currently too small, possibly non-existent, or going unreported, or their projected earnings aren't much higher than their current earnings. And in this case, both of these movies have already made bank. And that now brings us to the movies whose final domestic and global gross box office revenues I am currently projecting, which includes Moana 2, Wicked, Gladiator II, and Red One. For Moana 2, using a range of possible average weekly draws from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $411.9 million at the low end, $438.4 million at the mid-range, and $473.5 million at the upper end, which is significantly lower than last week's projection. But Moana 2 will still more than likely unseat Despicable Me 4 as the third highest grossing movie domestically so far this year, but it more than likely won't outperform the domestic earnings of Deadpool and Wolverine or Inside Out 2. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 50%, which is lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $823.8 million at the low end, $876.8 million at the mid-range, and $947 million at the upper end, which is significantly lower than last week's projection, and not only means that Moana 2 probably won't break $1 billion globally, it's probably not going to outperform any of the three current highest grossing movies worldwide: Despicable Me 4, Deadpool and Wolverine, or Inside Out 2. Regardless, Moana 2 fully broke even as of this weekend and is making bank. For Wicked, using a range of possible average weekly draws from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $406.4 million at the low end, $426.8 million at the mid-range, and $453.6 million at the upper end, which is a lot lower than last week's projection and is potentially now on par to potentially earn around the same amount of money domestically as Moana 2. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 70.36%, which is lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $577.7 million at the low end, $606.6 million at the mid-range, and $644.7 million at the upper end, which is considerably lower than last week's projection. But with its estimated break-even point range of $375 million to $450 million, Wicked has fully broken even as of this weekend and is starting to make bank. For Gladiator II, using a range of possible average weekly draws from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $164.6 million at the low end, $172.1 million at the mid-range, and $182.1 million at the upper end, which is lower than last week's projection. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 36.03%, which is higher than last week's, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $456.9 million at the low end, $477.8 million at the mid-range, and $505.4 million at the upper end, which is lower than last week's projection. And with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million, as of this weekend, Gladiator II has become a bona fide flop, as it currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $119.6 million to $293.1 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that Paramount Pictures, Scott Free Films, Lucy Fisher, and Douglas Wick currently stand to lose around $59.8 million to $146.6 million. For Red 1, given its very high production budget, I decided to estimate a range of average weekly drops for the movie using statistical calculations based on 9 previous movies that premiered between 2013 and 2022 that starred Dwayne Johnson, in which he had top billing and wasn't part of a broader recurring ensemble cast. That excluded the Fast and Furious franchise movies, but allowed me to include Snitch, G.I. Joe Retaliation, Hercules, San Andreas, Central Intelligence, Baywatch, Jumanji: The Next Level, Jungle Cruise, and Black Adam. These 9 movies have an overall average weekly drop of 32.01% with a standard deviation of 6.64%. From which I can create a range of possible average weekly drops for Red 1 from 25.37% to 38.66%. And using that range, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $101.5 million at the low end, $106.7 million at the mid-range, and $114.4 million at the upper end, which is lower than last week's projection. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 52.31%, which is higher than last week's, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $194 million at the low end, $204 million at the mid-range, and $218.7 million at the upper end, which is considerably lower than last week's projection. And given the movie's very high estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million, Red 1 remains a massive flop that currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $406.3 million to $556 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that 7 Bucks Productions, Chris Morgan Productions, Detective Agency, Amazon MGM Studios, and MGM Pictures currently stand to lose around $203.1 million to $278 million. So Red 1 could potentially become the biggest flop for 2024, since its current projected losses are on par with those of this year's current biggest flop, Argyle, whose losses range from $201.9 million to $251.9 million based on my own calculations. So as of this weekend, Gladiator II and Red 1 are definite flops, while Venom: The Last Dance, The Wild Robot, Deadpool and Wolverine, Inside Out 2, Despicable Me 4, Moana 2, and Wicked have all made bank. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to each and every one of you who has subscribed to support this channel. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, and Blue Sky by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.